So, good afternoon and welcome to our webinar on implementing IT service management. The webinar today will be presented to you by ITIL and IT service management experts Shirley, Lacy and Jenny Dugmore. Shirley Lacy has extensive expertise within the realms of ITIL and best practice framework, and Jenny has a specialist experience and involvement with the international standard ISO 20000. Jenny established and until recently chaired the International 20000 group, and in this role was responsible for the overall 20000 series. She's also been an editor for 20000 Part 3 Scoping and 27013 Integrated Implementation of 27001. Shirley Lacy is the ITIL author and project mentor for ITIL 2011. Shirley is involved in the development of the 20000 series and the editor of the process assessment standard. I will now hand you to Jenny, who will take you and kickstart this webinar for this afternoon.
Hello everybody and welcome. It's good to have people join us. As you will be aware, we're actually covering a range of different topics, best practices approaches to implementing ITSM and a practical approach of how you actually implement in real life. Shirley's going to pick up and go through a couple of case studies, real life case studies of using best practices approaches, and then at the end we're going to be having a Q&A session. Can I have the next slide? Thanks. Of course, there's a strong correlation between the way ITIL presents service management and 20000 presents it. Contrary to popular opinion, one isn't based on the other, but I think the best way of describing it is that it's got about 85% of the same DNA. So one isn't a direct copy of the other, but many of the people involved in developing the international standard were also involved in developing ITIL as well, particularly in the UK, and the origins in BS 15000. One of the things that it's worthwhile considering is how one bit of ITIL maps to the 20000 standards, and you can actually use ITIL advice to meet the requirements of Part 1, and we've just shown one slide here where it maps the advice in ITIL to a specific clause in Part 1, and this one is covering service transition, service operation and continual service improvement. And there are some differences, but as I said, about 85%, maybe 90% of the DNA is the same, so there is a strong link between the two. Okay, next slide. Can I have the next slide? Oh. Right, as I said, the best practice approach, what we're focusing on today is how ITIL and 20000 relate and how they can actually be used. And most people, even if they've not adopted any ITIL, if they've never even heard of ISO RACI 20000, they do have some policies, have some procedures, sometimes not very well documented, sometimes not very well consistent, but they do actually have something. And very commonly, people's first step is to look to ITIL to help them establish formal best practice processes, and that's where people often start. Quite often then they will migrate to deciding that they actually want to be certified under Part 1, and that becomes an organisational goal, and use ITIL as a route. And of course the 20000 series not only links into the kind of advice you find in ITIL, but it actually helps you understand the requirements of Part 1. So Part 2 just explains Part 1 requirements in detail. International standards have to be written in a way that an auditor can actually interpret it without there being ambiguity. So sometimes you need a little bit more advice and support on what that actually means if you're not a professional auditor. Okay, and typically what people will do in the long run is to have their policies, processes, plans, procedures assessed against 20000 by an independent certification organisation, and if they are successful, they then are known as what is certified, and they actually have proof that they've achieved a certain standard of service management, best practice service management. It's not possible to be audited against ITIL because it provides you so many options. It's where the virtue of 20,000 comes in. But people often don't stop there. They actually use that whole set of approaches to do continual improvement. And some people decide they won't go as far as being certified, but they actually just use the standard as a way of giving themselves some goals. Okay, next one. Next slide. Just coming, Jenny. So the first thing you actually do, you look round and you think, well, we know we must get better. Either we've been told we must, or we must be cheaper, or whatever. And you have to work out what to do best and what to do first, and then what to do next. And it can be a little bit daunting, particularly if you're very early in the process, if you're perhaps not very familiar with it, or if you've not actually had much experience of being certified under a standard. And the first step is always to find out exactly where you are, and then you have to work out where you want to go. And a gap analysis is the best approach to this. So you actually assess all your processes, you compare it to established best practice like ITIL and the standard, and you do a gap analysis. And the first thing you then do, as I said, is to work out where you actually ultimately want to go, and working back from that, you work out what phases you do it with. And I've actually got a favoured approach for this is to do a quick win first, so that you actually build the confidence that what you're doing is going to be effective. And typically what people will do is, if they've got very little, they will put in some of the processes that give visible improvements quite quickly. So incident and problem management are quite commonly the things that people start with. That then builds up. You build more and more processes in place, so that phase 2, you actually virtually complete all the processes you need and you actually start integrating them. Phase 3 is probably the hardest one, because it's making certain you finish the good work that you've started. So you've actually got to build into the phases a way of encouraging people. And phase 3 is where you actually have a fully effective management system. All your processes are present, you have continual improvement, you're managing your suppliers well, you're managing your relationship with your customers well. And my own rule of thumb on this is that you've actually got to be able to split the work. It's 3 phases is usually an effective approach. 3 phases perhaps over 18 months. That gives you a 6-month span for each phase. 6 months isn't too long that people think they're never going to get there and give up. It's not so short that you can't get significant improvements. I have known organisations make a really big change in 6 months. I've known people take 3 years. A lot depends on where you start. But again, my rule of thumb is don't make a phase so long that people give up because they think they're never going to get there. And the reason for doing this might not just be, it might be something other than certification. It could be that you have to have proof of governance for regulatory reasons. The other thing that you have to take into account, so Shirley, if you can go on to the next slide, that's fine. The people there. The other thing is that it's not one size fits all. You must understand the environment in which you're operating. If you're new to the organisation, you need to understand the history. Why did the organisation get where they are? What sector are they in? Because, for example, if you're in a time-critical sector, if you were dealing with health or something like the ambulance service, you'd actually have a different set of priorities and a different set of customers than if you were doing some kind of back office processing, perhaps sort of long-term things like pensions. And so that the attitudes and approaches of the people involved must reflect the sector, customer, some service requirements might be much more demanding than others. The other thing about organisational culture, and it's where the history of that organisation comes in very useful, if there has been a history of failed improvement programmes, you might have to be very careful about not being seen as, here we go again, it didn't work last time, it's not going to work this time. I have worked with organisations and been part of organisations where certain terms were just not acceptable because they were so closely associated with failed improvement initiatives. So that's the kind of thing you need to be sensitive with. And any big change like this is going to involve risks. So it's not that you can ever get rid of all risks, but you actually need to understand them, and you need to understand what is an acceptable risk, what isn't an acceptable risk, how are we actually going to manage them. And again, one of the biggest issues on this, I think, is the people involved in it. Next slide. Right. As I said, one of the early things that people do is they actually implement individual processes, quite often something like incident management, then they have problem management. As you go through the level of becoming much more sophisticated, you actually start full integration of it. But what you need as well for really effective service management is not just the individual service management processes. You need to have overall management of this set of processes. So that involves having management commitment, management involvement, and taking the management with you on this journey. If you're, for example, the person responsible for implementing really effective service management, you need to have regular contact with your managers, and even necessary much higher up the hierarchy. Take the customers with you as well. And one of the things that does take a while to get involved implemented because it's very easy to ignore is continual improvement. People do point solutions, they put out a fire, then relax. What you need to do is regularly check, what can we do better? How can we do better? When should we do it better? And the virtue of this kind of approach, the Plan, Do, Check, Act, is fundamental to 20,000, as it is to a lot of international standards of that kind, is that it actually links very effectively with the 7-step continuous improvement cycle in ITIL. But the fundamental thing is processes should never be in silos. They should always be effectively integrated, and overall service management should be managed as an entity. Next slide. One of the things I was talking about is management commitment, and one of the things I've noticed over the years, and I actually worked this out many years ago when I first got involved in service management, that some organisations have as many as 8 levels in their hierarchy. So the very senior management, who are the people that are driving the strategy of the organisation, people often don't know who they are, they've no idea what they're thinking. And that's one of the reasons that policies are such a fundamental part of achieving effective service management and achieving your objectives for service management. They give the senior level direction. So you don't have to know who the senior manager is if you're a very junior member of staff, but you need to know what they're thinking and what they're wanting. And the thing that then has to link into that is the process must, in many ways, link into the policy, so that the process is demonstrating what you need to do to achieve the policy and therefore the service management objectives. And under that, you actually get the procedures that actually link into the processes. So the policy says what you should be overall achieving, the process is what you actually do, and the procedure is how you actually do it. So there's a strong link. And again, to some people, this just sounds like a huge amount of documentation. And one of the sayings I developed a long time ago, having seen huge amounts of paperwork, is you should have a process that can fit on a postcard in the ideal world. Certainly your policy should be short. If things are very long, people don't read them properly, they forget the details, they actually don't get the key messages across. So really short but to the point, and they can actually then be just embedded in the way everybody thinks about their job. And it's the collective policy, process and procedures that help you achieve the objectives for service management. Again, I can't reiterate this too much. It should be simple, it should be short, policy, process and procedure should be integrated, and collectively they should meet the service management objectives. Next slide. Right, another way of looking at this, it's a different perspective, is that if you actually integrate the policies, process and procedures, you can actually also then think about the role of things like work instructions, which are really detailed instructions about what key you press when, things like the use of checklists and guidance. And if you actually look at this, one of the reasons the pyramid is in place is that the policies should be the shortest, the process and procedures short. You actually have more detail in work instructions, and the foundation of all this, and an essential part of it for being assessed against 20,000, is that you have to have the records of what you've actually done. And you need that not just for an audit, but you actually need it for continually improving what you're doing. So you can't improve unless you know where you are at the time that you want to start improving. And you can then, as I said, it's much easier then to go for an audit, and you need that kind of information for management reviews, but it's very much a hierarchy. It's not lots of documentations, but they are integrated, and the policies are the top level of it. And next slide. Now the thing about this is all this, policies, process and procedures, when people think about it, they actually think about a ring binder with paper, but there's a magic ingredient that is really, really important, and that's the people. People can either make or break your ability to implement effective service management, and it's too easy, I think, for us all to focus on writing something that's very effective and forgetting that actually this is going to affect the way people work. It might affect their career prospects, it might be for good, it might, they think, be for bad. But if that element of it isn't given enough attention, that's one of the reasons service improvement programs fail. So you actually need to sit and think, if you're responsible for this, how will it affect this individual? How will this person benefit from it? Is this person not going to benefit? In which case, how do we manage that difficult circumstance? And saying it's the magic ingredient, I think it's possibly more that it's actually just fundamental to success. It's the people that drive it. And if you have a committed team who are actually totally supportive of the best practice approach, it will go so much better than if people are just told, we're going to do it because our senior management think it's a good idea. That's about the worst possible entry to it. And again, it's back to individuals can break it, and you might have just a small number of people who are very unhappy about things. I said, I've never yet worked with an organisation where they've said, we want our service better, and it doesn't matter what the cost is. I've very rarely worked with any organisation that didn't think faster, better, cheaper, certainly better and cheaper. And one of the things about really good service management, it does make you more cost effective. It's not an overhead that you need to get a certificate. It's not an overhead so your senior manager can say, we fully adopted ITIL. It's actually a way of just making you much more cost effective. And the analogy I have drawn on this is a really basic one. If you start a new job, it actually takes you a long time to work out the best route to get to your work, your new workplace. And as you've actually built up experience of doing that trip several times, it becomes very fast, and quite often you find you get there in about half the time it took you on day one. And that's just what you're doing with improving processes. You are actually working out the best way of going from A to B, and actually once you've worked out the best way, you always do it that way, because it's so much more effective. And if you then add on things like the proactive elements of best practice service management, you actually stop things going wrong. And my own experience is I've worked with one organisation where when we started, about 5% of their activities were proactive, 95% were reactive, because they were constantly dealing with a whole series of crises. The management couldn't do anything but manage escalations. And by the time we'd finished the service improvement, about 50% of the time spent was actually proactive. It was stopping things going wrong. And suddenly, the reactive bit was a lot easier and smaller. And the managers were actually able to manage instead of actually just putting out fires and dealing with complaints. But faster, better, cheaper, although you have to fit what you do to the needs of your individual organisation, there is an awful lot of information around about these are the best general approaches. And one of the things that Shirley's going to go into with her case studies is actually reusing where you can things like the toolkit that we have used, because that actually gets you part of the way. It doesn't force you to take a particular approach. It gives you enough that you can decide what is best for your organisation without losing sight of the best practices in ITIL and 20,000. So I'll now hand over to Shirley, who will walk through the practical case studies.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Hi, everybody. I'm going to I've selected a few case studies out, but I'm going to talk through just generally as well how people apply the toolkit and use the toolkit in practice. So taking the best practice approach, building on what Jenny just said, with some practical advice as to what people do in practice. So the first case study I'm going to talk about is an organisation wants to create a global IT service management framework. So this is one of our clients. They're a global service provider. They were implementing best practice service management and have many stakeholders globally in regions, lots of process owners because they're very large, and customers were also very interested in the best practice approach. The problem was there was lack of agreement on process definition that led to inconsistencies. Because there were so many stakeholders involved, there wasn't always agreement, and that leads to very often a waste of time, but also inconsistencies in documentation, and very often duplication and gaps, because people, if they're working in silos, they don't tend to look sideways, and they can then duplicate information. So we move away from the simple that Jenny was talking about. So the assignment that we had was to assess for this organisation the process documentation involving the process owners, very much bearing in mind that magic ingredient, the people. You can do an assessment. One of the things with the assessment is to work with people so they also understand what you're doing as part of that assessment. And then we recommended and planned improvements. One of the things as well, there was understanding of different terms. The great thing about best practice is that people actually have a common term that they can use. And that helps in the understanding and application. So why did this client use the toolkit? They were very keen on the toolkit because it was an accredited ITIL official product that integrated both ISO 20000 and the ITIL guidance into one toolkit. So they could see they were applying both and achieving 20,000, so it really helped them to get it was a good match to what they were trying to do. They found the templates to implement service management processes very useful because it went to a level that many different stakeholders could understand and use it. And because it's based on experience of industry experts like myself and Jenny, but plus all our network of consultants and trainers that we use, it's very much tried and tested, and there's a good customer base for the toolkit as well. The great thing is it works for all types of service, all types of technology, and for all types of organisations. So for a large global organisation that's made up of many different functions, groups and units, then they find the toolkit very useful. So that's why this is quite selected to use the toolkit. On this slide, what we actually did for assessing the documentation was to assess it against the tiers of documentation that Jenny introduced. And what we've got at the top level, there's the Service Management System Manual and the policies. So we used an example of the policies for the target processes we were looking at to actually review their policies. Then we went down to the process and procedure level, and that was this assignment, was really focusing on those aspects. We were also asked to look at assessing readability and ease of use, and that was one of the things as the ITIL project mentor at 2011 that we did in ITIL. So learning, what is simple, signposting things for people, removing duplication makes it a lot easier to read, but also the way you actually write, and that's very important. We also asked to identify inconsistencies between processes so that we could tidy those up, and we also had a session with each process owner to explain the findings and identify improvements. So the process documentation in the toolkit that we actually use, so you actually look at the toolkit, we've got a screenshot here of the folder structure within the toolkit. And what we have in the toolkit, is in these folders, we have this pre-written Service Management System Manual that really gives you an overview of how the whole Service Management System works. There's a plan for a Service Management plan. So in this case, our client had a plan. There were just a few gaps there. There are many policies, 4 policies that are aligned with 20,000. There's an SLA template that you can actually compare. And then there's many processes, procedures, templates, and guidance. So what we did is to select the process of documentation that we were going to compare for this client. In the toolkit, each of the processes has, we're looking at service level management here, each of the processes has a process document, a process RACI, so that's the roles and accountabilities matrix that I'll show you in a moment, and then service level management procedure. Where relevant in the process documentation, there's also templates. So the service catalogue is a template that an organisation can take and use, and that can be adapted to each organisation. In this case, we didn't use that. We really focused on the process and the procedures. So looking at the process, if we look in the toolkit, you can see on the left-hand side as an example of the process documentation. So there's headings, main headings there. And then what we see is here comments in the right-hand column. And those comments are very useful for organisations because it actually gives you advice on how to customise the template in the toolkit for your own organisation. So, for example, the service management objectives that Jenny was talking about, you can actually then modify your process documentation to align with that for your own organisation. So in this particular client's case, we used that because we understood what their service management objectives were, and we were very aware of that when we came in to look at each of the individual process objectives. So each process has purpose, context of use, process objectives, process overview, which is where you actually put a diagram in. We provide examples of diagrams, but many organisations use different workflows. The inputs and the outputs, as Jenny was talking about, and the interfaces are really important between processes. And then process performance management. This was really useful in this case because the metrics were quite complicated and we could identify which ones were really, really key. In the toolkit as well, there are procedures. We didn't focus on that so much in this particular client's case, but we did do sometimes when it got down to a level of detail that we thought something was missing. So that was very useful too. So in the procedure document, you get the input into an activity and the defined output, and then the role that you'd expect to be performing that. What we see here is a RACI matrix. So a RACI identifies the roles and responsibilities for all the parties involved with regard to developing, managing, implementing and reviewing a process. So R is responsible, A is accountable, and we also have who needs to be consulted and who needs to be informed. So the column headings that you see here, things like top management, management representative, are typical names, but these are very usually replaced with an organisation's own role names. So one of the things we did for this case study was to map these roles to the organisation's roles, so we had a clear understanding from the beginning. And this is an interesting example, actually, because there was a lot of conflict. So X didn't agree with Y, Y didn't agree with Z. There was a lot of issues around roles and responsibilities because there was a lack of clarity. And a lot of that was to do with global roles, regional roles, and customer roles and local roles as well. So that was a key focus for us. What we've got here is then an assessment of the process structure, an example of the process documentation that we presented back, just one of the examples. So for each section of the documentation, we reviewed for the global process that we can see in the middle. We went through each of those and said, yes, that aligns with the toolkit, so that's the best practice approach. When we came to the high-level process, the recommendations to simplify the diagrams and consider adding proactive problem identification. One of the hard things with problem management is to actually create the problem record in the first place. But you get a lot of reward from doing that, as Jenny was talking about. If you can be proactive, then you actually get service management to really start to work. The process description and the RACI, basically the approach was okay, but we recommended specific improvements for each process, and that's where we really use the toolkit to identify those things that could be improved and discuss that with the process owner. And then for the related processes, there was some issues around the interfaces there, so we actually helped with the alignment between the different processes we were looking at. And the roles and responsibilities section in the documentation wasn't aligned with section 4 itself within the document, and we made recommendations on the RACI as well. So sometimes people misuse the RACI, and it's a really good thing to get that very consistent, because that's what people follow when they're doing their job. Measures and metrics were okay. Related documents, they need to simplify the way of referencing. Often when you reference documents, people reference upwards, downwards, sideways, and it can be very much simpler. If you've got a process document, you reference up maybe to the policy, but you don't have to reference down. The service management system itself should have a document index that does that. And then we also had a local process example, and there were many gaps in there, and very interesting that the document had been presented as a process, but in reality it was a procedure document, and we recommended that the procedure was moved out into a separate document. So the process does need to focus on what needs to be done, not how do we do it. How do we do it moves into the procedure document. So that's a real example from the case study. Other recommendations, we suggested ways of making it easier to use and follow for the target audience, and we used examples from the toolkit for that as well. We suggested restructuring it based on an industry standard approach, and that's in ITIL and 20,000, simplifying the documentation, and then standardise and simplify the high-level workflows. Quite often within IT, people are quite can be quite detailed, and really if it doesn't fit simply on a page, it's not easy to read. If font size is 8, that's quite difficult to get an overview. So the high-level process workflows should be simply enough. And then there were many specific improvements, and many of those are based on the toolkit. So the outcomes and benefits for this global service provider, they got confidence their processes were aligned with best practice, and getting that confidence really helped them to move forward. And it's not just one person moving forward, because I'm head of service management, was definitely keen on moving forward. What we did during this process is to get all the process owners keen to move forward in the same direction, and that was crucial. We had agreed a set of consistent process documentation that was aligned with ITIL and 20,000, and the process owners learnt what the toolkit could do for them, so they could use that for further improvement opportunities. And the big thing about it was standardising saves money and uses resources more effectively. So you get to a point in your development when you really do need standard processes, procedures to help people do their job. So that's the example of case study 1. I'm going to move on now to case study 2. And this is about speeding up IT service management implementation projects. And what I'm going to use here is an example of an organisation that we've helped, but it's very typically of many organisations that we've helped that are implementing major change. And it's how do they get started, how do they go through that to phase 2, and then phase 3 is achieving that full service management system where you've got this positive cycle ongoing of continual improvement. So the case study was an organisation that was doing major change, as many organisations are doing at the moment. Moving to online and mobile gives the business new ways of working after the economic crisis. It's a way out to actually help the business change to implement new technologies. And many organisations are going through this big change. So Connexia was involved in doing assessments over a period of major change, and this is several years, and we are helped to identify process improvements from those assessments. And also we worked very much during the assessments with process managers to help them understand what they could do, and they also used the information. We helped them to actually input into personal development. So really the assessments were a basis for reassessments, so we went back each year to do a reassessment. Although the process owners and managers were doing, they were making sure the process was working in between that. And it was very much a demonstration of ongoing improvement. And for the management team, that was really important, that they could see they were progressing. So the situation we had in one part of this journey that they went through phase 1, phase 2 and phase 3, where they faced really with this major change. The situation was that the change management process, which was based on ITIL, was really unable to cope with the volume of change that was coming through, and there wasn't really a risk-based approach to managing that change. So the approach we adopted and helped this organisation, we helped them to establish a service transition team. We used discovery and mobilisation workshops with their process managers to do that, so they got buy-in all the way. We also helped to identify improvements to change management, and a big part of that was to introduce standard changes, so more change could go through more simply. And we also used best practice standard templates from the toolkit for key processes that would help in major change. Excuse me a moment. So these were asset management, release and deployment management, and transition of new and changed services. So use a toolkit templates to help with that. So in the toolkit, we used the detail in the procedures, so we actually just took the procedures, customized them for this organisation, for these processes. And you can see here an example of the risk register, and we took this as one of the improvements for change management. So it could really adopt a risk-based approach to change management, and that gave them a much better handle to make good decisions based on that, the risks that they could see. And one of the other key things that we used was also the governance of processes operated by other parties. There's many people in the supply chain. New suppliers were coming in for online and mobile, and it was very important. We actually got the controls around that, so it was an important part of it as well. So we used the guidance within the toolkit there. So case study, we helped, doing the assessments, several process improvements, embedding the process on the way, and then we got to phase 3, which is really when everybody was ready really to really work together. Connexia was asked to help them to actually go through that final stage to achieve ISO 20000, and that was really establishing an integrated service management system. So that's what Jenny was referring to, and that's 2 ingredients really, was all of the documentation, making sure that was all fit for purpose, very much the tier 4 where you've got the records in place. And very often when you're coming up for an audit, you have to be a bit more formal about that because you're actually going to get audited on those things. So we very much use the toolkit to fill in any gaps. There was a lot there already, obviously, because they're at phase 3 by this point. But there were a couple of things that were missing, so it was a question of quickly filling those. How can we standardise things between processes and integrate them? So we did provide additional support, consulting and mentoring, so that the process managers really understood how to fill in those gaps, standardise. And a key thing was getting them all to work together. They were already started to do that, but really by the end of it, they were really working together as an integrated team. And one of the key things in there was them doing the foundation training for 20,000. It gave them a chance to get out of the office into a classroom, work together. So generally the classes were like 10 people. And so they really started to understand in that training the need to work together. So when they went back to their workplace, they really tried a lot harder. So that was really success that they got there. And they achieved 20,000 certification successfully. And there's a case study on our website as well that you can see here. So here's some key resources. So that case study is at the top here. And here's some resources. Here's got a reference to the toolkit here. And then here's some publications on ISO 20000 that Jenny and I have written, and Linda Cooper as well. So there's some references for you. I'll hand over back to Alex now, who's going to cover the toolkit in more detail.
Thank you both Jenny and Shirley. We just wanted to make you aware that for the registrants on this webinar, we would like you to be aware that there is a exclusive offer to you all that entitles you to £100 worth of free books to help your ITSM implementation, along with the toolkit for £595. I will just get this up for you properly. If you bear with me. If you just contact Adam Harrison, or allow him to just email him with your questions on this address at the bottom here, or give him a call directly, and then you'll be able to find out some more information about the offers that he is prepared to and offer to you, having attended this webinar. So any questions now would be greatly answered and welcome. So we have, I'm just going to check the inbox here. Okay, so this is one question to Jenny and Shirley. Just a question from a delegate here. How long might a typical IT service management implementation for an SME take from scratch, roughly?
For an SME, I think because it's quite often, it depends on obviously how big the SME is, but it can be quite quick if they use something like the toolkit. So it really depends on how many people are involved, how many services, and the way the organisation is set up. One of the key ingredients I find is if there's top management commitment and competent people that understand service management, it can be very quick.
Okay.
Can I just say I've actually seen some very good, very encouraging examples of an organisation, small organisations, getting everything done in 6 months. And one of the reasons they were able to get things done in 6 months is that they were all sitting in one place. It was a small organisation, so they didn't have the burden of trying to communicate to hundreds of people on many different locations. And it was much easier to get the team spirit and get everybody behind what was doing. And because it was a small organisation, they were actually also able to do quite simple processes and procedures. And because they were a small organisation, it was very clear what the senior management want. They were very clear early on that they had to be involved. So as I said, 6 months, and they went from fairly disorganised to very effective and very professional best practice, and they were actually certified under 20,000. The only thing that really delayed them was, had they enough evidence that they could cope with major change and were they doing proper continual improvement? But no, it was. I've seen 2 or 3 organisations do things that quickly, but there was one in particular that was certified after 6 months.
Oh wow. Okay,
and
then a follow-up.
I agree with that, Jenny. And I think one of the key ingredients as well is if you are starting from chaos, you tend to just accept best practice, and unlearning is sometimes quite difficult. People are attached to what they've done already, so that's another reason that you can do it in 6 months, starting from chaos or very little.
Yes, it's interesting actually, because people quite often say best practice and being certified in 20,000, it's only possible for big organisations because it's such a big overhead. Well, it's just not the case. It doesn't have to be a big overhead. You can run things with a big overhead if you really want to, but it's completely unnecessary. It might mean if you want to give a process to every manager of a certain grade, they have to have more than one process because there aren't enough of them. But that in itself cuts down communication issues.
Okay, and then a follow-up question to that then would be, in the extremity of it all, how much might that cost in the grand scheme? So from as little as the cheapest way of doing it, an effective way of doing it, or the most expensive cost it might take if you do decide to go the route of trying it on your own and starting it from scratch?
I think it's how long's a piece of string. For example, if you were quite a small, simple organisation, if you've got the management commitment, if you've got the people behind you, you could actually have half a person managing it for 6 months and you'd get there. I've known really large organisations spend many, many hundreds of thousands and get nowhere because they just approached it in the wrong way. If you don't have much of a journey to take, it's quite cheap. But I think the fundamental thing, it's a bit like seed money. You actually do some improvements first that actually generate efficiency savings so that they effectively pay for what you do later. So that after about, maybe a year after you've achieved best practice, it should almost be paying for it, all the costs up front by then. The payback is typically 3 years if it's been done effectively, I've found.
Wow.
But again,
I think that works
you can do
across
it.
many different sizes of organisations. And I think one of the key things that we discussed here actually is doing that assessment first to find out where you are in that journey. And you may already be 12 months into the journey. It depends on the size of the organisation. So I think that's how long this piece of string is really understanding where you are at the moment. But it's also have very good people that really understand service management, committed to doing it as well. And training does come in there as well.
Okay. Another question that we have is, we've already got an ITIL-based ITSM in place. What are the benefits of following or integrating ISO 20000 with this system?
I think one of the key benefits of doing it is that it raises the profile of what you've actually achieved. You're also reassessed on a regular basis by an independent organisation. So you actually sustain that improvement. It's easy to think we've done it now, that we can relax and people just take their eyes off it and things degenerate. If you're actually certified, you have an incentive to keep that certificate. Once you're certified and you've made all the improvements, it doesn't take much to keep ticking over, making it better. And again, one of my analogies is it's when I'm going to go to the dentist, I clean my teeth really well for the fortnight before I go, because I know the dentist is going to tell me off that I've not been doing my teeth properly. Well, the auditor, with all due respect to them, it's a bit like the dentist. You actually get someone completely independent coming in, and it's only when that auditor comes in sometimes you realise some things have lapsed. If that auditor doesn't come in, you're trying to do your own assessment, you're trying to take an objective judgment, but you're so closely involved in it. And I think that's the biggest benefit of it.
Okay. Jenny, do you have anything to add to that?
Shirley.
Shirley.
Sorry,
no,
Shirley.
I think that's a very good response. I would have answered the same. So.
Okay. I've had another question come in. We already have our toolkit and ITIL compliant incident management system in 9001 and 27001. But getting started with the gap analysis seems quite time consuming and onerous. What is your advice with that?
Shirley, do you want, in very simple terms, I would actually say the toolkit puts the foundations in place. If you haven't got foundations, your house will fall down. But Shirley, I think, could probably say...
Yes, I think it's actually within the toolkit is a self-assessment spreadsheet. So actually you can take any process and work through that and work out where you are. And the advantage of that is you actually, usually when people complete those process assessments themselves, there are different ways of doing it, but there's advice in the toolkit as to how to actually do the assessment as well. If you do that assessment, it actually makes you very confident in what you're doing today, and it helps to identify gaps. So the great advantage about an organisation assessing its own process is that it learns by doing it. Generally a good idea to have two people working it through to just make sure there's a balanced response. One of the issues though as well is terms, is understanding terms before you start. So something like incident in ISO 27000 is different to an incident in 20,000, and it's really understanding the scope of the assessment that you're doing and the different kind of worlds that you're doing it for, bringing that together. So terms, understand your terms first, and then use the self-assessment tools in the toolkit.
Could I also say, I think one of the things that it's worthwhile keeping in mind is to keep it simple. You can very easily get into the situation of making things too complex and too elaborate. So if your process isn't quite best practice, it doesn't matter if it's 92% there or 93%. Don't agonise over that level of detail. It's either there, partway there, or not there. It's that kind of approach. Because, as I said, you can just get analysis paralysis if you're not careful. And the toolkit was actually intended to help you lift yourself out of some of the complications.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think it's so important to understand the business environment and the service management objectives. And then if you're not doing something, really the question you have to ask is, do I care, or do we care as an organisation if that's missing or not? Does it give us risk or doesn't it? And I think making that decision, you don't want to go off and do something that you don't need to do.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question here. We implement ITIL just only service operation. What should we do next in order to add value from the current status?
Right. Well, generally when organisations tell me that, what that means is that they're actually doing in a formal way the service operation processes in ITIL. They're doing in an informal way all of the other processes. So they're actually currently today doing a lot of those other things. I think it depends whether you're starting, you kind of work, some organisations work backwards, so they work backwards through change management. And in the case study that I was talking about, the second one, they did exactly that. They started off with the operation processes, worked back through transition and service design. Meanwhile, top management were doing the strategy as a separate stream. So if you look sideways, there's probably other things going on, but it definitely works going from service operation back to transition, but then quite quickly recognise that big new changes coming in need to be designed well, or they'll just knock you over. So really an assessment helps them because it helps you to understand what's actually already going on, be it informal or in a formal way.
Okay.
I think one of the things I would suggest you look at is how much the service is costing. And if a service is costing a lot, then look down at why is it costing a lot? Is it because we're reactive? Is it because we don't manage change very well? Because you can actually then build up the kind of picture of value for money for making further changes that can be very convincing to senior management and particularly finance directors, because it's actually talking to them in the terms they understand. And you need to know how much things cost. You can't improve and make things cheaper unless you actually understand the cost as well.
Okay, brilliant. I have one final question. If anybody else wants to submit some more questions, we've got 5 minutes left in the webinar, but I'll submit this question anyway. If we were going for an ITSM implementation, does the toolkit you mentioned cover everything we might need?
I can't think of anything it doesn't cover. Shirley?
It covers enough so it's aligned with ISO 20000 and it provides guidance on ITIL. There are additional things in ITIL that some organisations would want to go for, but there's pointers in the toolkit to those things. But I think it depends where you're starting from. And basically, I think yes. What I wouldn't do is try and take the toolkit and customise it too much if you're starting from nothing. Because its benefit is that all that integration thought process is all built into the toolkit. So yes, it would help you with the best practice ITSM implementation, a complete one.
Brilliant. And then another delegate has said, is the toolkit easy to use? How easy would it be for him to pick it up and start from nothing? What would his first point of contact be within the toolkit?
Oh, right. There's a directory in there which is implementation. So there's a set of implementation tools. There's a document index that tells you all about the documents in there and the SMS manual. So there's guidance in the toolkit to help you through that. And there's also user instructions on how to apply the toolkit.
Brilliant.
I think picking up on the comment Shirley made about vocabulary, if you are starting from complete scratch and you know nothing about ITIL and you know nothing about 20,000, one of the early things you need to do with the toolkit is get familiar with the kind of terms that ITIL users in particular are just so familiar with. It's become second nature to use those terms as if they were normal English. So if you're a real beginner, terminology does matter. If you are familiar with ITIL, you probably don't even need to do that. You can actually just go through because it will read. It's not a competition for ITIL and 20,000. It's a complement and support for it.
Lovely. Thank you very much.